You're listening to Wild Things and Wild Places, a Muley Fanatic Foundation podcast that aims to discuss issues and efforts related to the Muley Fanatic Foundation mission, the conservation of mule deer, furthering the sport of hunting, and sound wildlife management.
Everybody knows I'm a Muley Fanatic.
It's time for Wild Things and Wild Places. And here's your guide, Joshua Coursey.
Welcome to another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. And joining me today, I've got a guest. When you talk about wild things and wild places, this is not something maybe you were anticipating. And boy, am I excited to visit and have this conversation with Rebecca Levine, who is part of the Monteith Shop with the University of Wyoming, not doing work on mule deer, though. This effort and the discussion we're about to have today is specific to moose. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh. Yeah, I know it's not your typical ungulate topic, but I'm excited to be here to talk to everybody about moose.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. I was prompted by Kevin, the good doctor, that you were known as the Moose Girl.
Yes, mostly around Monteith, Wyoming. That is what people know me as, but more broadly, too.
Yeah, and some of the photos that accompany this podcast, take a look at those. That's a landscape that many have probably seen. They're familiar with that country in that Monteith area. It's it's God's country, is it not?
I just felt so lucky to be able to do my research there.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about you before we get into some of the meat and potatoes of the topic of moose and your research and the efforts that you've put forth for some time now, specific to moose. But a little background on you, Rebecca. Share that.
Yeah, so I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, which is not really an area with too many wild places like we're familiar with in Wyoming. Yeah, grew up mostly in Rhode Island, moved around a lot as a kid, but mostly on the East Coast, and just always loved being outside. I started going to some camps and started learning how to camp and backpack, and eventually that brought me out west. So I was a backpacking guide for a number of years and didn't really know that wildlife biologists really existed. And then once I figured out that this was a job you could have, it was a pretty straight shot over here into this field for me.
Your undergrad work, where did you do that at?
I went to a really little school outside of Philadelphia called Swarthmore, and I did a biology degree, but it was really lab focused. So I just didn't really have any exposure to people who do research but are also hiking around and understanding the natural places where animals live until I got out west and met people like Kevin and the rest of the shop.
Yeah, so tell me about the transition to being able to be a part of the Monteith Shop and what that process looked like.
Oh man, so I finished college and I was working a bunch of seasonal jobs. I was mostly working some seasonal teaching jobs, and then was trying to make the switch into wildlife work, and I couldn't get anyone to hire me. And finally, a friend of Brittany Wagler's, who's another member of the shop, put us in contact, and she and Rachel Smiley were at that time the leads of the Wyoming Nutrition and Disease Sheep Project. And so they hired me as a tech. So I worked a summer catching bighorn sheep lambs in the Wind River Range on the Gros Ventre. And then from there, I spent one day in the field with Kevin where I can't tell the story on the podcast, but he really embarrassed himself.
Oh, no, you got to tell us now. You set the table. Share it.
He hired me. My silence is bought through him giving me this job. That was the start of it all. And once I got a taste of the shop, I have just stuck around. It's been almost 5 years now.
Yeah, what a team that has been able to be colleagues and work together. And I say team, and I say that with great conviction, because I've had many of opportunities to see the team interact in the field, and it truly is a team. It's not a job, is it?
No, definitely not. I think I've met some of my closest lifelong friends through working in the shop.
Rebecca, specific to moose, certainly there's been a lot of conversations over the last decade regarding moose, the decline in moose populations, a lot of the same concerns that folks that hold mule deer in such high regard. Very similar conversations, different causes sometimes, but when you look at moose in general and you look at some of the parasitic worms that have had an impact with particularly western moose, there's been a lot of concern and a lot of just cause for efforts like the work that you're doing that have really helped elevate the priority of why this work is so important, the merit behind the work. Moose in their southern range, it's acknowledged by all across the board. They've been in decline. We've seen that impact not only policy, but we've also seen that impact wildlife management and the opportunities that have certainly taken a hit. A decade ago in the state of Wyoming, there were over 1,300 moose licenses that were issued to hunters. That number is down now to just a little over 300, a direct reflection of the decline of the population. Your work specifically is looking at the factors that influence that, but then also what are the opportunities to mitigate or remedy some of those impacts. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me how you got just honed in on moose.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you're exactly right. And all across the southern extent of Moose Range, we've been seeing these declines. And I think the interesting part is, when anyone sees these declines and looks closer in all of these different populations where state agencies and researchers have tried to look closer and understand what is happening, they come up with different reasons. A population in Utah might find that ticks are to blame, or a population in Minnesota, it's the recovery of wolves, or maybe it's a different type of parasite or habitat loss. And that sort of having different explanations in every area makes it really hard to understand why this wide-scale trend is happening. Kevin was, before I started, involved in some great work that took a really zoomed-out view of moose populations declining all across the West and why that might be. And this overarching factor that connects all of the different declines is linked to these warmer and drier conditions in the southern extent of Moose Range. And that affects moose in a lot of ways. One is that their forage is less good when it's warm and dry. And two is moose are huge. They have dark bodies. They actually don't have sweat glands. And all of that means that they're just really heat sensitive, and that turns into this death by 1,000 cuts. It makes them more susceptible to disease, more susceptible to predation, lower reproductive rates, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the stage that was set when I was starting my work. And we know that it's hot and that's an issue, but how can we dig into what that actually means for moose on a day-to-day?
Rebecca, I'm curious, did you have a baseline of a data set that you were able to look at that was weather specific to temperatures and what those changes have looked like to be able to carve out a trail for you to want to go down that trail? When you talk about some of those factors, that when you look at warmer and drier summers and drought years, what was that in regards to that thermal set of data point? What jumped out on the page to you in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this sort of broad scale look at southern moose populations, it's the moose that are in these warmer and drier areas that have the lowest population performance. And then master student of Kevin's before I started, Tana Verju, who collaborated with the Wyoming Game and Fish in the Snowy Range, actually did some really wonderful work looking at, in the summer, the hottest time of year when moose are most heat stressed, what sort of habitat is most important for them to be able to stay cool, and we call that thermal refuge. So I had the benefit of having this really incredible work that she had built looking at what type of microclimate conditions do moose choose to be in when they need to stay cool. And then I could build off of that and say, okay, so we know moose really need wet soil. We know that they're dependent on riparian areas, both to stay cool because of that wet soil, but also because of good food. And then from there, that was a launching point for my work.
Interesting. Fascinating, actually. When you talk about being able to find that wet soil was very important or a key element for what would be something that just goes well with moose, like, how do you dial in on that? You tend to think of moose that live in areas that have a lot of irrigation or riparian water and tributaries and willows and all the things associated with what you would put together to be wet soil. But where was the measuring stick for being able to see how some of those ranges had potentially been vacated because of drought or moose just not occupying those landscapes that maybe they once had before in their decline?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think what's really interesting about this work looking at soil moisture is it combined two really cool approaches. So one is this really intense field effort. Tana was going out and going to the places where moose bed down and physically measuring what the soil moisture is, how much canopy cover is there, what is the temperature in that specific location, really intimately understanding where moose spend their time. And then she combined that with these biophysical models, which is a very fancy word for saying, how can we predict whether or not a moose can survive in a certain area? And so she basically was able to make these maps of the entire study area, the entire snowy range, and see what areas do we expect moose to be able to tolerate the temperatures and what areas are too hot. And if we say, okay, what if the temperature increases by 2 degrees or decreases by 2 degrees? You can do all this sort of experimental work to predict where can moose exist and where might we expect to see them start to blink out.
Knowing that this is maybe particular to a southern range, how does that look compared to our northern areas or even into Canada? Can you almost draw a line on the map and then you can be able to look and see we have seen climate change or we have seen these environmental impacts or changes that seem to be within this landscape across a broad landscape, mind you, but the impacts maybe not being as severe or lessened to the north? Is it a north-south? Is it just a location-specific issue?
Yes, that's such a good question, and there's some really cool research looking at all of these different reproductive metrics from the southern populations where we are all the way north into Alaska. And across the board, as you go from the south where it's warm to the north where it tends to be colder, you see this dramatic and persistent trend in reproductive rates. As you move farther north, female moose are much more likely to be pregnant. They're much more likely to have twins. They're much more likely to raise their calves into adulthood. So all of these different factors that contribute to population growth improve as we go further north into areas where there are cooler temperatures.
It's very thought-provoking for sure. And I live in a part of western Wyoming that we're not far from Fossil Butte National Monument. When I think of the landscape and the changes that this landscape has had for many years, to know that some of the plant life and the fossils that can be found in this part of the state, knowing that this landscape has evolved, has changed. When I hear things like climate change, I'm curious your thoughts on this specifically. Is it necessarily change, or is it just a cycle that is constantly changing and evolving? And it's not that we can just say, hey, it is truly climate change and it started here. It is really just a process and a change that is always occurring. And we're just now seeing some of the consequences of that due to some of the impacts that it's having to our wildlife. Where are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you're exactly right that throughout all of the history on Earth, there have been these dramatic changes and cycles in our climate. If we zoom in on our lives in the last 200 years, there is this persistent increase in temperature that is changing our landscapes, changing what animals can exist where, and will change the future of how our ecosystems work. And in that context, there's fluctuations year to year, month to month, all of these things, but this persistent trend of increasing temperatures, drier summers, hotter summers, that is what we're really zooming in on and trying to understand how that's affecting moose.
I can almost take this same content of conversation and apply it to like cheatgrass or other invasive plant life that we have seen on the landscape. It wasn't that long ago there was this notion that cheatgrass would not persist at higher elevations, and we've certainly seen that change as well. Specific to moose, being the moose girl that you are and known as, I'm curious about when you talk about these type of temperature changes and the impact that's having. You mentioned in reference that to the north we're seeing a higher rate of pregnancy and carrying of twins. I imagine the impact is across the board to not just the female population, but what's that impact look like specific to the rut?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. So this is actually a large focus of my work. We tend, when we study moose or really any big game animal, we usually focus on females because they're the ones that have the most direct impact on whether or not a population is growing or shrinking. And when I sort of started my work and started reading everything I could about moose and thermal ecology and just trying to get a handle on what do we know and what do we not know, this big gap that found and realized was that we don't really know what is going on with males because we just don't put that many resources towards studying the males. And so one of the greatest parts to me about this Monteith Moose project, which I ran for my master's work, was that with Kevin and with our collaborators at Game and Fish and our funders, everyone was on board to study both males and females. And so we were able to have 15 males collared, track them throughout 3 years, track their antler growth, and dig into how they were behaving during the rut. So I'm sure the podcast audience is all familiar with what the rut is, since a lot of hunters, and you love when all the males are running around making themselves visible. But this is really the core rut for moose is the end of September, beginning of October. And they are just, the males go absolutely crazy. They're running all over the place trying to find females. When they find the females, they're defending them from other males. They're having these dominance competitions with other males, all of this stuff that is very energetically expensive. And if it's very energetically expensive, it's probably even harder to do when it's hot out. The question that we zeroed in on was, as summers are getting longer, as falls are getting warmer, how is this affecting this really critical time of year for males, where they basically determine, are they going to be successful or are they going to fail and not find a mating partner?
Yeah, when I think of just my own firsthand account of the moose in the part of the state where I live, the end of the September, beginning of October, you were spot on. That is the time. Mm-hmm. In fact, what's interesting is 2 years ago on September 17th, and the only reason I remember this is that particular day, I seen 17 different moose on the 17th of September, and they were in very wide open spaces, wide open areas, moving around, traveling much as you would expect an animal in the rut to be doing. But when I think about, and I now put the thought to being able to seek thermal refuge, or to be able to know that there is this indicator of temperature rise, and then I just think of that activity, and I try to make the connection of how that vulnerable time of year for them, the extra additional resources that they're exhausting in that activity and just their movement, but then putting themselves in areas, being this dark spot on the landscape that draws that heat source. It's pretty fascinating. I think your mind can just take a conversation like this and just think of something that you hadn't ever thought about before or given any merit to. And I'm glad to know that you're dialing in on this. What are you finding? What's something that's just absolutely been a wow moment for you?
Oh, it's been, this specific question has just been like so exciting. So what we wanted to understand is these things that we know generally about how males behave during the rut. And then we wanted to add this layer of, okay, then what happens when it's hot out? And so what we know generally about males is as they get older, they get larger antlers, and these antlers are important in achieving mating success. So females are more likely to be attracted to a male if he has large antlers, and males with large antlers are more likely to win competitions with a male that's smaller. And so in that dynamic, we wanted to understand, okay, usually if we're not thinking about hot temperatures, male with a large body and a large antler is the winner of the rut, if we want to put it really simply. Being big, carrying around big antlers, that makes an animal more heat sensitive. So basically these traditional winners are also the ones that we would expect to be the most limited by warm temperatures. So we wanted to see, is it possible that warm temperatures are flipping everything around and changing who wins and who loses during this time? What we found was pretty surprising. So on warm days, like we expected, these large males had to reduce their movement, which we think was to cope with the fact that it's so hot out, they can't be expending so much energy. Whereas these smaller males, the younger ones, smaller bodied, smaller antlers, they can maintain their movement. They can keep being active, looking for females, all of that. When you hear that, what we expected is, okay, it's hot, that's affecting the big males, they can't move as much, so that must mean they have less access to females. And that was the part that kind of all of our assumptions broke down, because when we looked at how often they were coming in contact with females in the population, those old males were still able to maintain that contact with females, even when warm temperatures were limiting their movement. So the winners, even though hot temperatures are affecting them more.
And I would imagine, based off the information you've been able to garner in this research effort, the females are still preferring those locations that provide a little bit more thermal refuge. And the males are just having to move. They're having to cover that landscape to be able to seek that out. And I would think that does provide some vulnerability beyond just their exposure, but the exposure to the elements.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that, because moose in general are so solitary, these males are having to go find one solitary female, court her, hopefully mate with her, and then move all around and find the next solitary female, which is really different than a mating system like bighorn sheep that form harems. The bighorn sheep male will get all these females in one place and protect her, and that's just not the case with moose usually. So these males are having to cover a ton of ground to be able to find females.
Beyond what you've outlined and what I think many already attribute to with a larger antler, more dominant on the landscape in this rut, when you think about moose and you think about their antlers and the way that those antlers are so different than some of the other ungulates on the landscape, knowing that the moose tend to lose their antlers well before any of the other ungulates on the landscape, thin tissue, lots of blood flow, is that a cooling mechanism?
Yes. Yeah. So this is something that we're pursuing right now that I'm really excited to talk about. If we rewind a little bit into the summer when antlers are growing, antlers start growing every year for moose around April, and they're covered in velvet, this really thin tissue. They grow all throughout the summer. It's actually, antlers are the fastest growing tissue on Earth, the only regenerative organ in mammals. They're just this incredible biological structure and also just completely fascinating. Pretty just incredible when you think about how much energy an animal has to put in to grow basically this entire new bone structure every single summer. It's just this amazing feat. Yeah, and all of that growth is fueled by blood flow to the velvet that's covering the antlers. And so something that we did in Meeteetse, we wanted to understand thermal refuge for moose, but like I mentioned earlier, the past work that we're aware of focuses on females and what females need to stay cool in the summer. So what we were building on with our collaborators in Meeteetse was trying to add males to that equation and see, okay, we have a sense of what female moose need in their habitat to be able to persist, but we don't just want to assume that males need the same thing, so we need to do a comparison. And when we looked at where males and females were going to cool down, the biggest difference that we saw was females choose these shady, calm areas. So in a forest, in the willows, there's lots of protection from the sun. And we saw this sort of odd, surprising, unexplainable result that males were doing somewhat of the opposite. So they were going into these open and windy areas where they were exposed to the sun, which should heat them up, and where they had wind, but we also know moose are pretty well insulated. They have that thick hair all over their bodies. So we were really confused about what could be going on. It doesn't really make any sense. These males, are they just making bad decisions? That's usually not the case. Usually when something seems like a bad decision when we're doing wildlife research, it probably means we're missing something. And we agonized over it for a really long time until finally it dawned on us that the one thing we weren't thinking about was antlers, and that there's this huge surface area. There's all this blood flow to sustain this crazy rate of bone growth. The tissue on them, that velvet, is so thin, the hair is sparse. This is basically an amazing surface for heat loss in windy places.
That's a wow moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the fun part was so there's this guy, his name is Bernard Stonehouse. He was a researcher in the 60s, and he had this idea, and he published it, and then basically all of his contemporaries, all of the other researchers at the time, piled on and this is a horrible idea. How could you say that antlers promote heat loss? What are you talking about? And so now we're revisiting and thinking, oh, hey, this actually might not have been a bad idea. We should really look into this, especially for southern moose who really rely on the ability to dump heat from their bodies.
Yeah, and I think when you can have information that covers an entire range within the southern range, that this isn't just an isolated anybody within that range,
Mhm.
whether it's Idaho or Utah or Wyoming, if you just draw that line on a map and can see where this impact is, I know that there's been a lot of work that have been taken on to tackle, including many state agencies that have invested a ton of money in research, just being able to look at how the impact to the decline of moose populations can be related to a parasitic worm that seems to
Mhm.
thrive in warmer temperatures. And then when you extrapolate that and you look at some of the work that's been done in not only the harvest that sportsmen and sportswomen have been able to participate, but then carcasses that are recovered, and to be able to really get down behind the microscope and look at the impact that's had to their arteries and to their brains. There's just a lot of things that make moose vulnerable. And when you can just look at more and more things that are having impact, it makes for pretty fascinating conversations for me, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think exactly what you mentioned, one of the things that's been so rewarding about getting to research moose is the amount of support and buy-in that we have from our collaborators at Game and Fish and at the Forest Service, but also the whole town of Meeteetse, all of the ranch managers, everybody who I got to work with there, and everybody is concerned and curious about moose and wants to understand what's going on. So that was just one of the best parts of it all, was getting to see how many people care about moose and that this work is important to people other than me out there every day.
No, thank you for that. I truly mean that with the fullest sense of gratitude. Just thank you for what you do and the effort that you're putting forth. I am curious, though. You got to walk me through this. You got to help paint a picture for others to be able to see this. I've been on many captures of mule deer, and that's always an incredible experience to be able to be in the field, to be able to be hands-on with these critters. But they are a fraction of the size of a moose, and I would imagine just knowing that the way that field work is done is quite different than when you're doing work on deer. Your very first experience in being able to have hands-on in working with these massive beasts, that has to be something that I would think would stick with you for a lifetime.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it was. I don't think I stopped shaking for 36 hours after the first experience. I interviewed for the master's position, and at the time I was working for Game and Fish. I was a CWD tech in the northwestern part of the state. So my first moose captures happened in March, and I finished the workday and drove over to Meeteetse to meet Kevin and Sam Dwinell over to catch moose. And you mentioned experiences on mule deer captures. For most mule deer captures, we have the central staging area, and then the helicopter goes and gets mule deer and brings them to us.
Yeah, you're not doing that with moose.
Yeah, moose are not hanging from a helicopter coming to us. We go to them. And what we were doing in Meeteetse, since there's not too much snow accumulation, was we were darting them, not net gunning them, because there's no snow to cushion their landing. So with the darting, they go down smoother. And yeah, so I got there helping get everything laid out, and we have to do a little bit of a leapfrog style, like the helicopter goes and darts the moose and then comes back and gets the people and so on. Kevin and Sam left, and I'm waiting at the staging area, and then the helicopter comes back for me, load in there. I'd gotten the whole safety talk. You don't go around the back of the helicopter. I'm like shaking, terrified. The doors are off. It's freezing. You like land, and there's just this big black mass on the ground, and walk up to it. And my job was to hold the head, because that helps them breathe when they're sedated. And it took all of my strength just to hold the moose head. And then we were doing this leapfrog, which meant that while we're processing one moose, the helicopter crew is going to dart the next moose. So they come back, and it's time for Kevin and Sam to get carried over. And they give the moose, I'm holding the head, they give the moose the reversals. And Kevin, as me and the Game and Fish biologist, Bart, stay with the moose. And Kevin says, okay, reversals are in. Just keep holding the head until she stands up. Okay, so I'm just holding the head, and all of a sudden this moose shoots up on the ground, scrambling, trying to get away. And luckily she was pretty drugged, so she just stumbled away. But that was the first moose capture.
I'm sure at some point in your mind, you were even if it was to yourself, your own thoughts of, is there hazard pay?
Yeah, exactly.
And what does that look like?
Yeah.
Will I survive to collect it?
Yeah, and actually, it's so funny. So I think I completely forgot to mention the last thing Kevin said to me before he got in the helicopter to go catch this first moose was he was telling me all about all of the times that he's released a moose and it's turned around and attacked him. And so I went into this first moose capture being like, okay, maybe I get trampled, maybe I don't. Hopefully I can run as fast as Kevin can, which I know I can't.
Man, Kevin, what were you doing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine that's something that you'll never lose, just the memories of. And yeah, I imagine, though, even still to this day, when you know there is an elevated risk of that, you have a beast that size that comes to, there's a little bit of unknown of what that reaction is going to be. And you better have your A game.
Exactly, yeah. We have to have a respect for how strong and defensive moose can be.
Yeah.
And actually, I spent this time in Monteith studying wild moose and building a healthy respect for giving them their space. And now with this antler work that we're pursuing, trying to measure heat loss from antlers, we started collaborating with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game that has a captive moose facility. It's been really amazing to get to work with captive moose and hard to turn off the part of my brain that you're too close, get away, this isn't safe.
Best of luck moving forward on that front. Tell me about the specifics in looking at the heat loss from antlers. How do you quantify that? How is that a measurable aspect of your research as a scientist?
It's been really fun and a huge learning experience. So I mentioned we're working with these folks in Alaska at the Kenai Moose Research Center. So we're able to take a lot of fine-scale measurements on captive moose. And then we're also partnering with these researchers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who have built this software called Niche Mapper. And it's basically a way to create these like mathematical models of an animal and when it is at risk of overheating. And so what we're trying to do is take really precise measurements on captive moose and use that to build a mathematical model of the role of moose antlers. But when we get down to the nitty-gritty, what that means for our work with captive moose is we're taking a lot of thermal images to get at measuring the surface temperature of the antler combined with a measure of their internal body temperature. So there's a device called a rumen bolus, which basically we make the moose swallow a temperature sensor, and then we can see what its core body temperature is and then what the temperature of the antler is. And from there, we can start to understand how much blood flow is there to the antler, how much of that is radiating away. Does that have enough of an effect to mean that moose are less likely to overheat when they're growing antlers?
Wow, I'm geeking out on what you just said. That is absolutely mind-blowing. I love it. I'm drinking the Kool-Aid. That's great stuff. That's tremendous.
It's been really fun.
Oh, I can only imagine. Yeah, good for you. Is there a more vulnerable time of year that you've been able to find through mortality specific to something that you could tie directly back to body temperature and that being a cause or a contributing factor to the mortality of moose within the research project?
That is a great question. I think what's really interesting about studying heat stress in moose is that it's so nuanced, and it is this like death by 1,000 cuts more than one dramatic event. So I think usually when I start talking to people and we're talking about heat stress, they imagine like it might hit 100 degrees and we see that a moose dies. That's not exactly the reality of what happens when it's hot out and moose are having to cope with this. What happens more than the direct effect of heat is this accumulation of things that can make moose more vulnerable to mortality at almost any time of year, and maybe especially winter when they're relying on their stored fat reserves. So if we think about over the summer, moose are trying to eat as much as possible. They gain a bunch of fat. That helps them survive the winter. And then if we add this heat stress on top of it, let's say usually a moose would eat for 6 hours a day, but now it's really hot out and they have to reduce that to 5. And then it's 5 hours instead of 6 hours of eating a day across the whole summer. What that accumulates to is way less energy that they use for their day-to-day functions, for raising their calves, for gestation, for survival. So it is this sort of pathway of heat influences energy, which influences everything else.
What we're talking about with moose has a very similar dialogue to what we see with mule deer, that there is just not this silver bullet. There are many factors that are, as you said perfectly, a death by 1,000 cuts. Have you been able to, in this work, identify or be able to prioritize a conservation effort that could pay ultimate dividends for moose populations? Is that specific to habitat? Is that specific to, what would that look like for you if you were to look at it from a conservation aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest overarching habitat need for moose to be able to these increasing temperatures is that wet soil. So when they're able to lay down in wet soil, that water can basically pull heat away from them. And in those situations, moose are able to withstand high temperatures in a way that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. So protecting streams and rivers that have water flow all summer long, and where the ground is moist around those areas, being able to conserve beaver ponds and complexes that hold water all summer. That's the most important things we can do for. And another thing that I'm really excited about actually is I talked about this connection between we need thermal refuge, but a lot of this stuff does come down to energy and nutrition. So we need this combination of wet soil, protection from warm temperatures, but also habitats that provide really good nutrition to moose. And so there's a project starting in the lab doing some experimental habitat treatments to see if we treat willows, if we do these mowing treatments, could we actually spur an increase in nutrition for moose and have this two-pronged approach of protecting thermal habitat and increasing the nutrition that's available to them on the landscape.
Rebecca, it's been an incredible visit with you. I find it to be extremely moving just to know that this type of work at the level or the layer of what this work looks like at the detail effort that you're putting forth. It's tremendous. I thank you for sharing what you have so far with us. I look forward to being able to visit with you in the future. On that note, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't ask or inquire what's the future look like for this work, and what are some of the challenges and things that give you vigor to tackle this and excite your efforts as a research scientist to want to continue to trudge ahead? Thank
you so much for having me, and just fun to talk about this work and hear what it brings up and what ideas it brings up for other people. And let's see, the future of the work. So we're digging into this question about antlers, which I'm really excited about. Can we measure how much heat is lost from antlers? And then from there, we want to jump into heat loss from antlers is really helping moose. Let's dig into the structure of antlers across moose range and see, are some types or sizes or shapes of antlers better at promoting heat loss than others? And we're hoping to do that in collaboration with the Boone and Crockett Club that has such an amazing data set of antler morphology across space and time. So that's something that I'm really excited about. And I think especially since moose antlers are something that just fascinates people across moose range, I think it'll be an exciting way to connect this work to people who love to watch moose, love to hunt moose, love to have them in their yards. One of the best parts of the work in Monteith was like all of that research happened because of basically one very concerned citizen who kept bringing up moose declines to Game and Fish, and Game and Fish got on board, and then together we all embarked on this work. So I think one of the big motivators for me throughout all of this work is Mary Rumsey, who's the concerned citizen. Just exciting to to know that this work matters, that so much that someone would make sure that something happens and not let go until we're looking into what's going on with moose.
Yeah, that's it right there. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned the concerned citizen and citizen science and those observations and how that can spearhead and move movements like this or efforts like this. I think that's a responsibility of all that enjoy our wildlife resources and are on the landscape, and those observations that are over a duration of time bring these type of questions forth to our wildlife managers and to our research entities like the Monteith Shop that are equipped to be able to tackle these type of questions, to be able to have further understanding and an increase of knowledge, and how that can be applicable to not only the management, but then ultimately policy, et cetera. There's a lot of moving parts there, but it all starts with caring first.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it all starts with the public showing that they care about something enough to have researchers and agencies come together to make something happen.
I know that you're aware of this, but we, the Muley Fanatic Foundation and the Monteith Shop, are hosting the very first of its kind event on April 5th in Laramie as a collaborative effort. It'll be a great event at a tremendous venue there. You've been to that venue many times, I assume?
Yes, yeah.
Going to be an exciting event. You'll be on hand. This isn't just going to be about talking about mule deer specific work from the Monteith Shop. This is a partnership with the Monteith Shop and all that the Monteith Shop covers, including work on bighorn sheep, including Rebecca's work on moose. And so if you're looking at your calendar as a guest of the podcast listening to this today and you have nothing planned for April 5th, we have a great event that'll be coming to Laramie, the first of its kind. And I can tell you at the shop, at headquarters for MFF, we begin what is a very busy season for us that runs all of February, March, April, and into May. And it begins on February 8th in Big Piney. But this event, and being the first of its kind in the collaboration with the university, the Monteith Shop, and MFF, it's going to be an incredible event. I'm excited, and you'll be there, and folks can visit with you directly, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Everybody come talk to me about moose. I can't shut up about them. So yeah, please come. Let's talk about moose.
All right. Rebecca Levine, again known as the Moose Girl, particularly around the Monteith area, talking about moose and the great work that's being led by the Monteith Shop and Rebecca specifically. Rebecca, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh.
It's been another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. Until next time, happy trails.
And that wraps up another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. But remember, the journey doesn't end here. Make sure you never miss out by subscribing. Whether you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, streaming us on our website, or following us on social media, subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more wild episodes.
Everybody knows I'm a muley fanatic.